It's about 8:33 here on the East Coast. Jim Warren is on your screen. He's in Chicago this morning. Mr. Warren, we started off this morning talking about whether or not, this is based on The Economist magazine, the event this weekend is going to be an inspiring event or whether it's going to be a parody of democracy, that being the vote in Iraq. What do you think it's going to be?
Well, it could be a mix of the two, Brian, and hi from a cold and windy Chicago this morning. I think for the White House, as they've now signaled, any vote will be seen as a victory. But I think to a lot of folks around the world, particularly in the Middle East, I just got off the phone with a friend in Gaza who works for the United Nations. This will be seen as a put-up, as a sham orchestrated by the United States. I think that's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality.
Mr. Hitchens?
No, I mean, I'm not going to split the difference. It's extraordinary that there's an election in Iraq. If you run into Iraqis around town, which I have done, or hear from Iraqis by email, and Kurds as well, which I do every day practically. Haven't been there for a bit, but it's all the difference in the world. It's a night and day difference. They can't believe their luck. They can't believe they're having a say in the future of their own country. The fact that it's being made so horrifically difficult by a Muslim Nazi, Mr. Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, who was imported into Iraq by Saddam Hussein before the overthrow and is now the baptized, if that's the word for it, it's the wrong word obviously, the anointed leader of Al-Qaeda in the country, has announced that he's not just against this election, he's against all elections on principle. Elections, he says, are blasphemous and profane, a filthy Greek import into the purity of the Muslim world. Well, you couldn't have it more plainly delineated than that, and I have no difficulty choosing what side of the line I'm on.
Jim Warren, a lot of our callers said, well, the media is going to decide whether this is a success or not, and you don't have to agree with that, but in your opinion, what will people have to say to make it a success?
I'm not sure what the question is, Brian. What will the media have to say? What will people like?
Well, let me try to be more articulate. I apologize. It's early out here. When the dust clears over the weekend and the voting is finished, what will have to have happened to make it a success?
Well, I mean, for the White House and for folks like my good friend Christopher, with whom I just flat disagree about this, the mere fact that one today is having, for instance, in Rosemont, Illinois and Skokie, Illinois, folks going to the polls, I think in one of 4 or 5 places in the U.S., is a symbol of a clear, unequivocal victory. I simply flat disagree with Christopher because I think that the broad spectrum of historical evidence suggests that social transformation cannot be imposed by external force. For sure, it can bring a degree of order, but the evolution from the distinctly traumatized society that Iraq was to one of stability and coherence has to come from within. And I would just quibble, and Christopher's been there and I haven't, I would just quibble about how to interpret the manifestations of what is going on now. I do not think they are ones necessarily of a democratic culture. I just simply don't think those can be imposed by external force.
When the election's over, who will be the leaders that emerge, in your opinion, from what you know?
Can I just
Yep.
not make it seem as if I duck Comrade Warren's challenge?
Right.
If Iraq had been left to rot the way it was, if the Saddam Hussein regime had been allowed to, as it were, collapse naturally, or implode, which is actually what was happening to Iraqi society, then everything would look like Fallujah by now. The people waiting in the wings were the people like Zarqawi, who were going to try and take over. There was already in existence an organization called the Fedayeen Saddam, conveniently named to symbolize the fusion of Baathism with jihadism. There would have been civil war, and it would have drawn in the neighboring states, opportunist interventions from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, at the minimum. It would have been a nightmare, a black hole. It would have been worse than Congo is now. The intervention that we made, I think, came too late and was too little, but it saved us from very, very, very much worse. So I think it's precisely to the contrary of what Jim has said. as with the American Revolution and France, there's a certain minimum of force that's needed before anyone is going to pay attention. If it wasn't for French troops, no one would ever have heard of Thomas Jefferson. Sorry to say, but it's a brute fact. There'll be many other comparable cases. To your direct question, if the vote goes roughly as we think, namely if the Sistani list, or Sistani-backed list, wins, and especially among the Shia, and if the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is running in tandem with its rival party, well, there'll be a very heavy turnout in northern Iraq too, also does well. I have been told that the nicest rumor I've heard from Baghdad this week is that the Shia will invite Jalal Talabani, the Kurdish leader, to be the president of Iraq. All the Kurds are Sunni, by the way. Well, not all, but most of them are. And then the prime minister might very well be Ahmed Chalabi, who's had a fantastic comeback in the south. Has been campaigning very well, in company with Sunni politicians, by the way, in Shia areas, and who has also good contacts with the Kurds. He's a possibility. And then there are a number of Sunni figures who can be offered other important posts. But the first thing that the Iraqis I'm talking to want to do, if they win, is to show that they don't want a triumphalist sectarian regime. Now, this is extraordinary when you consider the provocation they've been operating under. You could be killed just for being Shia in Iraq at the moment. And Mr. Zarqawi denounces the majority religion of the Iraqis, who are not his fellow countrymen. He's a Jordanian thug import.
We're going to
as heretics and scum.
We're going to the phones shortly. Mr. Warren, what would your reaction be if Mr. Chalabi ended up as the prime minister?
Well, I'd be rather stunned, particularly given the initial influence. We now see his distinctly distorted view of what was going on, his and that of other members of what might call a Iraqi diaspora had early on, particularly when it came to weapons of mass destruction. I think he's been rather discredited, but clearly had an impact on a set of U.S. actions which resemble in some ways the huge mistake of trying to flex our muscles and exhibit imperial power in, for instance, Somalia in 1992. Christopher is going to disagree, but I think that the disarray one sees now is a reflection of the mistake of our initial unilateral action. I don't have a crystal ball. I hope it's calmed down in a year or two from now. I suspect it will not be.
Mr. Hitchens, why so few Iraqis based in the United States? Supposed to be about 250,000 of them eligible to vote, and only 25,000 signed up. And the figure I heard this morning, only 17,000 are going to vote.
It's very infuriating, it seems to me. Is it the International Organization for Migration, the IOM? I can't give them very high marks. I mean, I'm involved with this quite a lot. I know quite a lot of Iraqis and Kurds. I would have had no idea if I was an Iraqi where to go or what to do. And they were given almost no notice, and they have to travel, in many cases, quite long distances. And we know that in Detroit, well, actually, particularly in Dearborn, Michigan, there's a community. We know that there are a lot of Kurds in Nashville. But we don't have a very good idea of how spread out the Iraqi diaspora is, and I don't think anything like enough attempt was made to find out. Still, I mean, that's to say, I mean, an Iraqi Jew actually came up to me in New York recently after I'd been giving a lecture and said, did I know how to help him get registered? And I said, well, I'll try, but you're starting with asking me? He said, yeah, I don't know how else to begin. He's a smart guy, but didn't know. So it's a pity, because I think there are 4 million Iraqi exiles, all told. Many of them have been living in democratic societies, acquiring qualifications of all kinds. Was dearest hope in the long run is they have the chance to go back. They exercise their right of return. And this is a very shaky start to reintegrating them.
Christopher Hitchens here in Washington with us. He's a graduate of Oxford's Balliol College, BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Our guest, Jim Warren, from New York City originally, is in Chicago, where he's the Deputy Managing Editor of the Chicago Tribune. He is a graduate of Amherst. We go to Athens, Ohio, to start with. You're on the air.
Yeah, hi. I was really shocked to hear that Ahmed Chalabi was actually a candidate. I thought this guy is a thug, as far as what I've read, and that he was really wanted by the U.S. government for handing off fabricated intelligence to the Office of Special Plans. And I wanted to ask both these gentlemen whether they will do their parts in doing more investigative reporting about the group of folks, I guess, who operated the way I understand it and read out of the Office of Special Plans, giving passing off this fabricated intelligence that was passed then on to the American public about the WMDs.
Thanks. Jim Warren.
Well, personally, I've got enough on my plate, and I think the paper and many other papers have done a fair amount on Mr. Chalabi. Obviously, the most vivid manifestation, most sort of controversial bit of reporting was done by the New York Times and a reporter there named Judith Miller, who used Chalabi apparently as a significant force. But I think Christopher has a different view on him, given a piece, Chris, that I think you posted on Slate.com a couple of days ago.
Is that right?
Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iran. Not all of them were found. We don't know what the Iraqis did with what they declared that we couldn't later find. But it's not a matter of inventing them. The Iraqis declared a certain number. They never gave an account of what they'd done with them. They're not allowed to destroy them themselves by the terms of the UN resolution. That would be a very grave breach of the resolution. They have to turn them over, have them bagged, tagged, and disposed of under international supervision. They didn't do that. They kept on with their policy and strategy of concealment. Since then, we've found, which the inspectors would never have found, the elements of a nuclear centrifuge in the garden of Dr. Mahdi Obeidi, who led the American forces to it, buried in his own garden, he being Saddam's chief nuclear physicist. We've found the evidence of Saddam Hussein trying to buy missiles off the shelf from North Korea as late as March 2003, just before the intervention, going onto the international black market that's been partly exposed, by the way, by the intervention, as was the Libyan and Pakistani network exposed by the intervention. There's a great deal of non-proliferation, a good consequence from the invasion, in other words. And then if you look at the Dwelfer report, which you have to do, you'll see really alarming stuff about chemical and biological warfare and the elements that were discovered of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the CIA, which has got everything wrong in Iraq from start to finish, had made a crude attempt to frame Ahmed Chalabi recently as an Iranian spy. Totally failed. He's pursuing a lawsuit in the United States against the false charge against him of embezzlement in Jordan. I think he might very well win that lawsuit. And he's gone, by dint of extreme political skill and courage, to being very nearly the public face of the Sistani list.
Greenville, South Carolina. George Bush supporter, good morning.
Good morning. How are you, C-SPAN?
Fine. What do you have to say?
Well, your guest from the Tribune made an interesting comment at the beginning. He sort of inferred that the Iraqis need to do more, if not necessarily just overthrow their own government without our help, and that's their role. But, you can't fight a revolution anymore like we did. Back in our days, the weaponry was different. Now you can't fight a tank. You can't go up against the government's weaponry. You need help from the outside, and that's what we're providing. And I think it's a little bit unrealistic for him and even naive to assume that that's the current role in this world we face. People need our help. We've freed millions of Shiites, millions of Kurds from this guy who is raping all the resources from the people and sticking it in other people's pockets and keeping all the oil resources. I think we've done a lot, and I think it's too naive to think that we should have total peace in just a few months or a year or two of this excursion. I mean, it took Europe decades.
Thanks, caller. Mr. Warren.
Well, again, I just think the broad spectrum of historical evidence suggests that you can't impose social transformation by external force. I also think that whereas I might stipulate to some of Chris's chronology of what Saddam was up to, I think history will suggest that he was in a far weaker state than we realized, but the evidence of that was there. It was reflected in the increasing brutality. It might have led us to be a little bit more imaginative in dealing with an array of forces within the government and to try somehow to patch up relations with the broader world, in particular via the UN, and have somehow a larger, more multilateral force there. I think the way it is now with just us, history suggests that's not going to work. And when it comes to, how we treat minorities, I think particularly on a week in which we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Chris mentioned the Nazis early on. That one has to remember that one big test of democracy is how it treats its minorities, and I think the jury is definitely out on what's going to play out as far as that goes in Iraq.
Hold your thought, Mr. Hitchens. Let's get Washington, D.C. in here. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Hitchens, there were countless post-war blunders or miscalculations, like the Bush administration likes to call them. But the CIA recently admitted that Iraq is now a training ground for terrorists. So when Bush and Cheney say it's better that our soldiers are fighting the terrorists in Iraq than here at home, I wonder, was that the administration's plan all along, to use our soldiers like bait? And wouldn't that be considered treason and a war crime?
Dear me, I think you misunderstood what the CIA may have said, though I think I would decline the task of interpreting CIA analysis for you. There is a common fallacy, though, and I'll make a guess that I think you have a share in it, which is that terrorism is produced by the resistance to it. In other words, which we heard when the intervention took place in Afghanistan, it'll be a quagmire, it'll turn the Arab world against us, the Arab street, and so on. Actually, we're hearing now from the Arab street in Iraq, and people are still complaining about it, that if we fight them in Iraq, it'll only make them angrier. Well, this is the same mistake as people made about New York and Washington, D.C. They thought, what have we done to make them do this to us? You see what I mean? That's the original error. Mr. Zarqawi was correctly identified right in front of the United Nations by name by Secretary of State Colin Powell before the intervention in Iraq took place. Now, think about it. After September the 11th, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan started expelling al-Qaeda people, pretending they hadn't known them, helping to round them up in many cases. There was no country in the world that could afford to have anything to do with them or be seen to. But Iraq started to invite them in from Afghanistan after September the 11th. And Mr. Zarqawi was brought to Iraq by Saddam Hussein after September the 11th. Now, what conclusion do you think it's legitimate to draw from that?
Fort McCoy, Florida.
That we invented this guy, that we brought him on? No.
Fort McCoy, go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Real quick question. How is the Iraqi vote affecting Europe, given the large Muslim community? And one other thing, Mr. Hitchens, long time ago, I spoke to you on the phone through C-SPAN, and I was talking about emotional politics versus reasoning politics. I said that the definition of intellectual is rational rather than emotional. You said, I wonder what, after I got off of what dictionary he's reading from, the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. And I just wanted to make sure that I told you what dictionary I read it from. Thank you very much.
Did he tell us which one?
I'm not sure that he did.
Are you still there?
It was. I'm telling him that he asked after I got off. He said,
which dictionary?
He said
American Heritage.
The definition. It's what dictionary is this guy reading from? So I'm telling him the American Heritage.
Okay, I thought you.
I'm not even sure what word is being defined. I'm sorry.
Rational, I think.
I wonder if that was really me. It doesn't sound like the sort of question I would ask.
Mr. Warren, what about Europe?
Well, I don't know. Tell me how many folks are going to be voting there. I mean, obviously, a lot of what's going to be playing out in Iraq with the elections and the aftermath will be seen in a wider Europe through the lens of a distinct anti-U.S. hostility. And I think, unfortunately, here's where I probably also part company with Christopher. I think that's the way it'll be seen throughout the Middle East. I think the elections will be seen as an American show. I think they'll be seen as a sham. They'll be seen in Gaza and elsewhere, again, through the lens of an anti-American view, and they will not have the sort of cleansing, irresistibly, irretrievably cleansing and liberating impact that the Bush administration hopes.
So what's it going to take if you're right? You know, they're supposed to write a constitution and then have elections later on in the year and all that. At what point would the Europe or any place else believe the situation if it turned out positively in Iraq?
Well, at the point, presumably, that you'd have all the manifestations of a truly democratic culture that was born from within and not imposed. I'm not going to discount the possibility that I'll be proven wrong. I just think that history underscores the virtual impossibility of imposing all this by external force. Will there be folks in Europe and elsewhere who will never buy into the possibility that the preemptive invasion was a masterstroke, yeah, I mean, that's the case. But, you know, for millions around Europe who are simply antagonized per se by our actions, I think most of those will never be convinced.
No, that's probably true. I mean, one isn't going to expect to get praise from Al Jazeera either, but there have been notable comments in Arab media, print media, by influential Arab commentators saying, look, the only two elections that are happening in our world present are among the Palestinians and in Iraq, and both of these are, so to speak, enabled by the United States or by foreigners. You know, what does that make us? What can we stack up against that? If you look at our own internal politics in the Arab world, they're a shambles and a disgrace. There's a lot of opinion of that sort also to be found in the Lebanese press, which is fairly free, where there's also going to be a contested election, I hope, fairly soon. There's a good deal of osmosis, I would say, about it throughout the Arab world. And I'm afraid that, Jim, I think you contradict yourself in terms. You cannot say that an election is being imposed on people. The United States is not forcing anybody to vote. What it is enabling them to do so. This is a release of Iraqi liberties from a previous very hideous confinement by a very menacing and threatening regime. It was a country that was a prison on the surface and a mass grave underneath it.
Keyport, New Jersey.
And an arsenal.
Keyport, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to know if anybody remembered that the United States had help from France in its revolution. And also, too, I wanted to know if anybody wanted to comment on the economics for the United States of how that the money that's being spent there is going to change the policies that were there before, as far as, you know, them accepting France and Russians and Germany money, and is that going to switch and change?
Mr. Warren?
Well, I mean, presumably if this works out and one has a freely constituted, sovereign, independent government or, you know, a string of governments, no matter how future elections go, and some, you know, clearly free market economic system, perhaps, then, you know, I'm sure all bids for virtually anything will be entertained. So I wouldn't have much doubt if this works out and we do ultimately have a democratic culture which is fostered. One will also have a democratic economic culture that is fostered, and you know, whether it's you know, French aerospace or Russian oil firms, that you know, a free market and some form of capitalism could conceivably flourish.
When was the last time you were there?
In Iraq, the summer of 2004.
So last summer.
Yeah.
Concord,
No, before that. Sorry.
Concord, New Hampshire.
Before that.
Good morning.
Hi.
Mr. Lamb, Mr. Hitchner, Mr. Warren.
Morning.
Mr. Hitchner, I am going to send my husband out today for your book.
Oh, thank you.
It looks right like it's like this. It's on my desk here, so you can see what it.
Yeah, would you mind just waving it a bit?
It's Love, Poverty, and War: Journeys and Essays. Christopher Hitchens, brand new, out in late 2004. Concord, go ahead.
Mr. Warren, I have a bone to pick with you. I guess being a psychologist, I think you're sitting in a very defensive position. But I don't agree with you about the UN, and I don't agree about the way we're treated or the way we're held in respect or disrespect by Europe. France and Germany are loaded with Muslim residents. I don't think they wanted to get involved with this because they didn't want an uprising in their own countries. And I support what the president's done. I support our troops, and I pray, and I hope and pray that this election, under the aegis of the United States, or under the troops and the safety that they can provide, God bless these Iraqis who go to the polls. That's my comment. Thank you very much. God bless C-SPAN.
Well, now you've made me so unalterably self-conscious here. It's difficult enough being in the presence of Mr. Lamb and Mr. Hitchens, but now I think I'm going to have to change the positions of my arms and legs, lest you be proven correct.
But
here.
it appears you can't do that, though. Watching you right there, you still have your arms folded like that. Did you realize you were in a defensive position?
Well, in the presence certainly of Christopher, that just may be an absolutely natural reaction, and in the presence, I should say to you and your viewers, of someone who now has attained even greater iconic cultural status as a result of being rather specifically, even ostentatiously mentioned Tuesday night on the WB program The Gilmore Girls. For your viewers out there who somehow missed it, this favorite teenage show opened with a scene in which I believe a Yale undergrad was quite frustrated with her inability to get through to C-SPAN on a caller line to voice her opinions about Iran, which is just to suggest Gilmore Girls today, perhaps Christopher and Brian, Desperate Housewives tomorrow. So, Brian, you better watch out. You'll probably be making me more defensive. But as far as the substance of the call, I don't really think that German or French reaction had anything to do with any anxiety over internal, domestic disruptions as a potential result of supporting the U.S.
What's the situation in France? Roughly how many Arabs are there, Muslims, and what is Mr. Chirac really doing, in your opinion?
I think Mr. Chirac's policy was that of a clientele relationship between himself and Saddam Hussein. Went back a long way. It was a family business. I mean, he used to have Uday and Qusay Hussein to come and stay on their holidays in Paris. He helped build Saddam Hussein a nuclear reactor, knowing what he wanted it for. Very firm friends, and certain money would have changed hands as well, because that's the way Mr. Chirac does business. He had to run, after all, for the presidency of France, partly to, well, in fact, entirely to retain his immunity from prosecution, which he would have faced otherwise, for these many crimes and depredations as mayor of Paris. The guy's a pimp, basically. He would have taken this view if there were no other Muslims in France. Now, as to how many of them there are, it's a very good question. It is officially thought to be something like 10%, but there are many Muslims who believe...
10% of France?
Yes.
Which would be 6 million.
There's a lot. But there are many... I'm trying to remember the name of the French author, Gilles... it might come back to me in a second. He said that there are many Muslims in North Africa, fundamentalist Muslims organizations, who believe that the figure is much greater, and who think that France is already on the verge of becoming a Muslim country. They refer to it sometimes as part of the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. That's wishful, of course, but it shows how some Muslims conceive of this as a sort of demographic revolution.
Danbury, Connecticut, good morning.
Oh, good morning, Brian. James Warren, I'd like this question addressed to him, please.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, James, I'm wondering, I heard Chris Matthews mention this quite a few months back, before this Iraq thing and all, about we do not strike another country, because I know there's some, I don't know which flag it is, but it's always with the American flag, a snake coiled up which says, "Don't tread on me." Now, what do we have having gone to Iraq at anything, at any point, what does, how does that give us the liberty to do something like that and then, blame Saddam and all when he wasn't the culprit for 9/11 and all? How does this all tie in? And is there anything in the Constitution that could back this up, saying that, Bush can be impeached because of doing this, that he did go against this, which is very important, "Don't tread on me," which is a symbol of the Americans, and it's on that flag. I asked the person that screened me. He didn't know, so I don't know which flag that is, but I know it's a snake. It's very important. Would that have any correlation in getting Bush impeached because of the action he took, which was certainly unjustified? And Brian, may I ask you something?
Certainly.
I see all these magnets support our troops and all. Well, I went to a meeting and I found where I could get a magnet, bring the troops home now, which I let backslide, and I didn't do it because of the holidays, and I'm getting 2 of them now. I was wondering, and I won't do this, but I was going to ask you, can I give this number out in case anyone else wants to? Because all I see is support our troops, support our troops.
Sure.
I'll give it out on the air if you'd allow me.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. It's area code 212, which is New York City, 868-5545. I'd like to see those on the cars, because I think it's high time that the troops are brought home now, because this war was certainly unjustified, and Bush should have been impeached long ago.
Thanks. Do you know what flag she's talking about?
Yes, it's an early a flag of the American Revolution, and I have a feeling it was designed partly by Benjamin Franklin. It's sort of a pretty impressive-looking water moccasin or some kind of tough snake, and it just underneath says, "Don't tread on me."
And Mr. Warren,
it was a very early colonial revolutionary slogan.
do you want to respond to our caller, Mr. Warren?
Well, on the subject of possible action against the president, I mean, one perhaps could argue that if Mr. Hyde of Illinois and his merry band could find it justified to bring articles of impeachment against someone for oral sex in the White House, that, hey, why not for something like this? But the practical reality, the political reality is there's no chance in the world that it would happen. And as far as bringing the troops home, I think the difficulty in the position that some folks like myself have in being very critical of the invasion, thinking it was wrong-headed, thinking that it will not attain the goals that the Bush administration and people like Christopher hope. The problem I have right now is, okay, so what do? Do you bring them home now? I think that would be disastrous. I think the double-edged sword that people like myself face is that at this point we can't afford to fail. I personally wish we could somehow convince a much broader force via the UN to come in, but they seem to be shell-shocked for a bunch of reasons and nervous about coming in, seeing the escalating violence. But I think at this point the impact of our pulling out would be disastrous.
Jim Warren with the Chicago Tribune in Chicago this morning, and Christopher Hitchens, who writes for Vanity Fair and Slate.com, here in our studios. They'll both be with us for another 55 minutes. Benton, Arkansas, you're on the air.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask this, okay? Now, in this plan of the Constitution that they're going to draw up, is it going to give rights? I mean, what I mean is it going to allow the voice of Christianity to be spoken freely? The voice of Muslims to be spoken freely? The voice of Jewish people to be spoken freely without the fear of being killed?
Mr. Hitchens?
Very interesting question. I mean, you would hardly know from most of the coverage of Iraq that I can't tell you exactly. It's between 3 and 4% of Iraqis are Christians, usually Nestorian or Chaldean Christians. It's a very ancient form of Catholicism, and may well be the oldest Christian community in the world, and certainly the earliest biblical footprints are to be traced in Iraq. And there's a tremendous contribution made by Iraqi Christians to the life and culture and architecture of the country, and many, many respected Iraqi citizens. There's been an attempt recently to blow up their churches and intimidate them, try to drive them out of the country, as was done to a very large number of the Jewish people of Iraq in 1947-48 as a kind of tit for tat for the expulsion of the Palestinians by the Israelis from their homes. Actually, in 1947, there were more Jews in Baghdad than there were in Jerusalem. It was a very, very old center of Jewish life. Now, the draft constitution that Iraq was drawing up before the terrible outbreak of violence in the declaration of the state of emergency did have entrenched guarantees for Christians, yes, and it was beginning to discuss whether or not Iraqi Jews who'd been dispossessed and expelled from the country would have the right of return. In fact, that was one of the things that began the aggression of people like Muqtada Sadr and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, was exactly the claim that crusaders and Jews were being indulged by the new transitional authority.
DeSoto, Texas. Good morning.
Hey, how you doing, Brian?
Good.
All right, Brian. Good to hear from the A-team again. I think you're very great, real good commentator. And one thing, I'm kind of new to Washington Journal, but I'm glad I didn't know anything about this during the Clinton impeachment era, because it would stress me out a lot. But one thing I just want to do, I just want to defend Mr. Warren on the lady said that he had his arm folded. Lady, he's in Chicago. Give him a break. It's kind of cold out. And Mr. Hitchens, you know, I agree with you a lot on certain things, and you know, but you've been like a pit bull with Saddam Hussein, and I know you gonna always try to get him. And one thing about it, after spending $1 trillion and losing thousands and thousands of soldiers' lives, we just, you know, we all in. It's like poker, you know. Once you done called and raised, and you know, you can't fold because you all in now. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a great Friday.
Mr. Warren, there's your philosopher protecting you from DeSoto, Texas.
It's my arms being folded are clearly an act of self-preservation amid the meteorological onslaughts here today.
Is it really that cold out there?
No, not for us, and shouldn't be for a Hoosier cable television host like yourself, but maybe all those years in the East have changed you. Is the blood a little thinner now? I don't know.
Before we move to the next call, I do want to bring up something that Mr. Hitchens might be interested in, and that is the series that started on, I'm not sure what date, was it January 19th? No, it was before that, 18th, or whatever day it started on, your series of Henry Kissinger telephone call notes. Tell us about that, and where can people see them?
Well, if you go to the National Archives...
No, but I mean, where can they see your stories? Are they on
Oh, well, you could try to navigate, I guess, our website, chicagotribune.com. I think you'd have to register, and I'm not sure if the fact that it's a week or two old may mean you have to pay a buck or two or go to Nexus Lexus. But it was a series which ran last Monday through Friday. There are thousands and thousands of pages of Kissinger transcripts. In most cases, he had his secretaries listening in unknown to the caller, and then in shorthand taking down notes and then transcribing the conversations. Mr. Kissinger, no surprise, had no intent of these seeing the light of day during his lifetime. The initial deed of gift to the Library of Congress was such that they would not appear until 5 years after his death. That was litigated. He lost. Those are now all available, and off what I've seen, I think they are, to put it mildly, stunning. As Chris knows, because he's been very solicitous to me on this subject in the past, I've spent a lot of time listening to Nixon phone conversations, and I think my first sense in looking at hundreds and hundreds of pages of Kissinger's own transcripts is that they provide a much better, much more nuanced, and not more in any way flattering sense of the gentleman than one receives in his phone conversations, which his boss, Mr. Nixon, taped all those years. But last week, the difficulty for me was figuring out how, for a daily newspaper, you divvied this stuff up. So I decided to open with a couple of parts on the astonishingly, depressingly incestuous relationship that Mr. Kissinger turns out to have had with the elite of the Washington media. Those conversations, or some of those conversations, with everyone from Joseph Alsop to Barbara Walters, ran last Monday and Tuesday. And then there was a part related to a, at the time, very prominent United States Senator from the state of Illinois, a moderate Republican who was a dove during the Vietnam War and was much disliked by Kissinger and Nixon. That was Senator Charles Percy. Then, I believe last Thursday, was what I considered almost stomach-turning series of conversations involving Mr. Kissinger and genocide in Pakistan in the year 1971, where the U.S. government, despite the clear, unequivocal warnings of its own diplomatic staff in Dhaka, turned the other way because of practical, pragmatic considerations involving the then covert entreaties to China, which was using the military dictator Yahya Khan, General Khan, in Pakistan at the time. I know Christopher has spent a lot of time on rather unseemly aspects of Mr. Kissinger, particularly involving the overthrow of the Allende regime, but Chris, some of this stuff on Pakistan back in late 70, early 71 may match that in some ways. And then finally, I ended up with a lighter, arguably more frivolous set of conversations. Mr. Kissinger clearly was exceedingly attentive to the powers that be in Hollywood. There are lots of conversations with those folks, and in advance of the coming to Washington of the then head of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, his top priority, it seemed, was to somehow find Brezhnev copies of U.S. Western movies, including ones with John Wayne dubbed in Russian. So he was working the phones to various big shot producers in Hollywood on our time, trying to find Westerns dubbed in Russian. So it's a grand buffet of the life of Henry Kissinger that is found on these transcripts, which he did not want us to see, certainly not right now.
Go to chicagotribune.com to find them. We're talking with Jim Warren and Christopher Hitchens, Waldorf, Maryland. Thanks for waiting. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Brian, and I'm active duty Air Force, and I just have a couple of comments. I haven't been to Iraq yet, but I know airmen, soldiers, and Marines that have been there. And I want to remind the lady from that wants to get the sticker about bring the soldiers home or whatever, that all of us are volunteers, and the majority of servicemen and women that are over there, a big majority, we are proud to be there. This was a slam dunk, as Mr. Tennant said. We may have not found any weapons of mass destruction, but just like Mr. Hitchens said, the president of France, Mr. Chirac, remember, he tried to help Iraq develop a nuclear power plant. Atomic weapons have been around since, what, the 40s, correct? And what you have now is a situation in Iraq where people, just like Mr. Hitchens said, people are coming across the borders from Saudi Arabia and all the other countries, Al-Qaeda, and plus you have the leftovers from the Saddam Hussein regime. And this is going to go down in history. And it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next month. But this is going to be a historic thing. 25 years from now, President Bush is going to be looked at as a great leader. And I'm not very political, but I tell you one thing, Mr. Warren, there's plenty of real estate in France.
Thanks. Mr. Hitchens, will George Bush go down as a great leader in your opinion?
If he helps to evolve the formation or birth of something that could reasonably be described as a Palestinian state, which we're going to find out fairly soon about, and if he adds this to the liberation of Afghanistan and the stabilization of Iraq, and if he's able to negotiate some kind of demilitarization agreement with Iran, yeah, that would be a historic presidency, certainly. And it's within his grasp. It's possible. It's thinkable that he could do that.
Chicago, you're on.
Hello?
Please hang up and try again.
Chicago, are you there? No, for some reason or other, we got a cross line. LaSalle, Michigan, you're on. LaSalle, Michigan, are you there? Please go ahead, LaSalle, Michigan. Hello?
Hello?
You're on the air, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I was hearing you the whole time.
I'm sorry. I wasn't hearing you, and so there's something going on downstairs. Go ahead.
Yeah, to Mr. Warren, I'm sorry to gang up on you here, Mr. Warren. You mentioned a little while ago in this segment, bemoaning the fact that we didn't get enough cooperation from our allies in the United Nations, and we now know that the French, the Russians, the Germans were all in cahoots with Saddam Hussein under the auspices of the Oil for Food program, making fortunes, making untold amount of money, while the people of Iraq were suffering and being essentially ripped off from the money that was supposed to benefit them. Now, this is what mystifies me about the American news media. There's no way that a Republican president, in my opinion, can win with you guys, no matter what he does. He's damned if he does, and he's damned if he doesn't. and the oil for food program is not being investigated by people like you in this country, and it's probably one of the biggest scams that has ever been perpetrated on people in the history of this planet.
Thanks. Mr. Warren.
Well, first of all, as far as sort of being allegedly dogmatic and the president being damned if he does or damned if he doesn't by that supposedly evil liberal media elite, which I represent, working for a newspaper that has not endorsed a Democrat for president since Horace Greeley ran. Let me just say that I agree with Christopher's analysis about how Bush will be looked at in history if he's able to pull some of these things off, particularly a Palestinian state. As far as the oil for food program, I think the caller's rendition is a distinct caricature that has been fostered by folks on the political right and many of the facile United Nations bashers. The absolute unequivocal reality of that program is that of all the thousands and thousands and thousands of contracts that were signed and approved, every single one of those contracts were inspected by two members in particular of the UN Security Council, Great Britain, and more than Great Britain, the United States. We knew every single thing that was going on with that oil for food program. So to sort of suggest that this was something run amok and we didn't know about anything, we had our reasons for looking askance at what undoubtedly was some level of corruption. But we'll still have to do, I think, a fair amount of analysis. We'll see what Mr. Volcker, the former Treasury Secretary, says about all that. But sort of lost in this is the United Nations, the U.S. government's complicity in the program. If there were unseemly matters that went on, if there were folks getting, oil in ambiguous fashion, you better believe it that we knew about it.
Well, who is the we there? I didn't. You didn't.
Well, we in this case would mostly.
It doesn't sound as if, from what you say, could have known either. I mean, the fact that it's a very widespread scandal with a great deal of complicity doesn't, it seems to me, minimize it so much as maximize it. And remember, we're talking about very important elements here. While Iraq was being starved and beggared, and various intermediate clients were being enriched, an underclass was being created in Iraq, something that they hadn't had before, a sort of lumpen, miserable, starved, frightened, uneducated layer of people, of course, who are now, in many ways, the easy prey for the fanatics, the cause of much of the woe of the country. I mean, this is really important stuff we're talking about. There's 12 years thrown away of Iraqi life and history and poisoned, which we're now having to clean up. I think probably the worst element of American foreign policy was the period when it had sanctions plus Saddam Hussein.
Millinocket, Maine, good morning for Christopher Hitchens and James Warren. You're on the air.
Yes, Brian, thanks for having C-SPAN here. And I just wanted to make a comment that the man that just called up recently about that it's an all-volunteer army and that he was speaking for everybody. I just was wondering that if he thinks that there's going to be really a better outcome now that we're in Iraq, and that if they think that the government is going to be a legitimate government. That's my only question.
I think he's tuned in a bit late. I think we've done that. I don't want to do it again.
Well, let's go to Bowie, Maryland, then. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bowie.
Thank you, and I appreciate the discussion this morning. I wanted to say that I understand Mr. Warren's point about history not bearing out the ability to impose democracy from outside, but I was wondering how he might reconcile that with World War II and what was done with Germany and Japan, which clearly weren't democracies before we went to war with them. And maybe if Mr. Hitchens can provide some perspective on that as well, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I already said... well, okay, you go first, Jim.
No, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I had already said that the name of Thomas Jefferson would never have been heard if it wasn't for the French military intervention in the war in North America. So just that for a start, you make a perfectly good point, not just about Germany and Japan, but also most of the countries of Eastern and Central Europe. redeemed from fascism by force. I can't actually think of very many cases where there's been democracy without some kind of foreign intervention precipitating or enabling it. So you're pushing an open door with me.
Mr. Warren?
I just think apples and oranges, preemptive invasion versus the incursions in various other nations by Adolf Hitler. I don't think it's an apples to apples comparison.
Miles Honeycutt of Alexandria, Virginia. Will the news media lead with the death toll on January 30th or the voting percentage? Will it be 20 dead in Iraq as Iraq votes, or will it be Iraq votes with 10 million votes and with violence of 20 million dead? Who decides with the media to run with freedom first or with death? Mr. Warren.
Interesting question. I think we may cop out and go with what we in the newspaper business call the double-barrel lead. So I think we could have an amalgam of the two. But I do not doubt that high up in those stories, no later than a second graph, will be the death toll, if there is one.
Hudson, Florida, good morning.
Yes, sir. Good morning, gentlemen. It's my belief that this war is, this election will be an American sham. And I believe that the root cause for this war was the oil. And it's still the oil. If America was really interested, or George Bush was really interested in human rights, we'd be doing something in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most repressive regimes in the world.
Caller, let me ask you a question. We don't get that much oil out of Iraq, so how do you figure on this?
Well, because it's control. Most of the known oil resources in the world are right there
so you think it's
Iraq.
a future decision? You think it's a calculated decision inside the White House to go for the future?
Correct.
Is it for personal reasons or for political reasons?
Both. Both.
So the people that are
money, and money is power. And I don't think human rights has anything to do with it, or very little to do with it, because if it did, then we wouldn't support people like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. I mean, what are we going to set up in Iraq?
Go back to your premise though about the personal and power. Do you think the people that run the country sit around and say, if we make a move and spend $200–300 billion over in Iraq, we will benefit, our pocketbooks will get fatter? Is that the way it works?
Well, I think that's the primary motivation, not only personal, but we want America to have that oil, to control that oil.
Thanks. Mr. Hitchens, you start.
Oh, God. Well, if you want to talk about blood for oil, that would be the UN Oil for Food program, I suppose. I mean, I've got a slightly tired of this sort of moveon.org type argument. There is a reply, though, that would take into account what you think is the double standard. It's true that the president has never used the word Saudi Arabia in any critical sense. He's never mentioned it, for example, in the same sense as the word terrorism, though it's known that the Saudis have been the source of a huge amount of the funding and encouragement and training of bin Ladenist-type forces around the world. However, though it can't be, so to say, announced publicly, removing Saddam Hussein was a form of putting the Saudis in their place. The Saudis, if you remember, were very opposed to this operation. They wouldn't let American soil be used for it. American forces had to be moved to Qatar in order to take part in the liberation of Iraq. And if Iraq's oil industry is recuperated, which we very much hope it will be for the sake of the Iraqi people, it'll be quite a blow to to Saudi Arabia's existing monopoly in the region. Which is why I think there's some covert Saudi hand in some of this aversion in Iraq at the moment, because they certainly don't want to see a Shia democracy on their border. Actually, they don't want any kind of democracy on their border, but preferably not a Shia one, because the much exploited workers in the oil fields of Saudi Arabia tend to be Shia Muslims, doubly discriminated against. So they have every interest in seeing this outcome fail. Thus, it is absurd of you to suggest that an oil policy an oil-driven policy in Iraq is also motivated by Saudi interest, when in fact, if you really thought about the politics of oil, which you haven't done, you'd see that the reverse was the case.
Mr. Warren, do you have anything to add?
Well, there's a pretty interesting piece in the January-February issue, the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, an array of articles on the Middle East, one by Dennis Ross, the fairly well-known chief Middle Eastern troubleshooter during the Clinton era, a guy who I think by his admission met something like 500 times with Yasser Arafat. And it underscores I think the grotesquely obvious that securing the flow of Middle Eastern oil has always been, remains a central tenet, central priority of U.S. foreign policy. Was that the reason the Bush regime went into Iraq? I don't think so.
I don't know whether either one of you gentlemen saw this, but I thought it might get an interesting comment from either one of you. The president met with the New York Times yesterday, and it says here, but even while acknowledging that Iraq is at a pivotal point in its history, Mr. Bush appeared far more relaxed than he was in August when he was last interviewed by the Times, and that was somewhere in New Mexico. He laughed when asked about his admission on Wednesday during a news conference that he had not read the article in the periodical Foreign Affairs, written in 2000 by Condoleezza Rice, his new Secretary of State, laying out his foreign policy. Quote, I don't think, now he says, I don't know what you think the world is like, but a lot of people don't sit around reading Foreign Affairs, he said, chuckling. I know this is shocking to you. Are you surprised about that, Mr. Warren?
Given the circulation of Foreign Affairs, no, I'm not. And, but, I mean, it is interesting to get those characterizations of sort of the new, more relaxed Bush. And why shouldn't he be? He's got job certitude for another 4 years. He's convinced that he is on a mission. His, I think, often troubling level of moral certitude is verging on stratospheric heights post-victory over Mr. Kerry. So, and he's got in theory, a rather faithful Congress. We'll see what happens over the next 4 years. So he should be relaxed even when he enters the den of the evil Eastern liberal establishment press at the New York Times.
30 minutes to go. Atlanta, good morning. Atlanta, good morning.
Mr. Warren.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Hello?
Please go ahead, sir.
Oh, Mr. Warren, earlier in the program, I believe that I heard you say that Saddam was a lot weaker than many people imagined, and I wondered if your implication was that he was about to fall from within, or there was a possibility of that happening. Because if that's what you said, it's the first time I've heard it. And
thanks, caller. Fall with
no, I mean I'm not. Yeah, no, I'm not sure that that'd be the first time. I mean, we'll have to see a few years down the road, but it's my sense that we may conclude that the obvious increased brutality that he was exhibiting toward his own people was a decided sign of weakness, and that we should have somehow worked with an array of internal processes within rather than unilaterally invade. As I said, I think we fell victim to the same mistake that we demonstrated in Somalia back in '92.
We were talking earlier about Mr. Warren's articles on the Henry Kissinger notes on the phone calls. Did you write a book about Henry Kissinger?
I did.
What was the title of it?
It was called The Trial of Henry Kissinger.
Then there was a movie that came out.
And it was made into a documentary, which is called The Trials, just for variance, very sake of variety. It's the case for indicting Henry Kissinger for crimes against humanity and war crimes.
The reason I'm just looking at a transcript. One of the reasons this intrigues me is because the niece of the man that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger are talking about works at this network, and I wonder if she's ever seen this. A fellow named Charles Collingwood, who used to be at CBS, our own Eloise Collingwood is his niece. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, I'll just read you. This was you have in your article. Later that evening at 10:05, Kissinger spoke with Nixon. Kissinger. I think it went extremely well. They're talking about a speech the president gave about Vietnam. I think it was a most effective speech. I thought network commentaries went very well. NBC and ABC were good. CBS, I just caught pieces of it, but Collingwood And then he runs off. President Collingwood, what was he doing? Kissinger, he said, Hanoi said there must be a political settlement before a ceasefire. President Collingwood is a communist. He is married to that pretty wife, very left. He is no damn good. What do you think of my doing? What do you think of my doing low-key delivery? He was moved right into that. Is that typical of anything you've heard before?
No, it's a lot more laid back. And what you tend to get from there's a hideous telephone conversation between Kissinger and Nixon on the eve of the invasion of Cambodia, the illegal, secretly planned invasion of Cambodia. Nixon is hideously drunk, and he's in, I think, in Key Biscayne with Bebe Rebozo. Both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, then I think Mr. Laird and Mr. Schlesinger would have been, are opposed to the invasion of Cambodia. So Kissinger's backing Nixon as National Security Advisor, and I think he's hoping, obviously, for Mr. Laird's job as well. Excuse Mr. Schlesinger's job. But it's, you know, it's risky. He's helping this secret war within the White House. And the drunken Nixon sort of slurringly says to Kissinger on the face, if this doesn't work out, Henry, it's your ass. And you have these two hideous thugs about to complete the destruction of a neutral country in Asia, and, you know, just as sordid as anything could possibly be.
We need to go back to the phones. We'll get back to this in a minute, Mr. Warren. Let's go to Newark, New Jersey. Good morning.
Yeah, hello?
Hi.
Yeah, it's my first time I'm calling. I'm familiar with Mr. Hitchens' work, and I saw the film about Kissinger. Yeah, my question is, I guess, kind of two-part. I think what's been overemphasized in the media is the word democracy, and I think what's underemphasized is oil. I mean, there are 29 countries today where they don't allow religious freedoms. It was mentioned earlier about Saudi Arabia, Egypt. For example, Singapore, if you're caught with 500 grams of marijuana, you're hung. Jehovah's Witnesses are caned and thrown in jail for 10 years. So obviously, there must have been a factor that Iraq was chosen to bring so-called freedom, so-called democracy, and it's obviously it was oil, because, I mean, when Nixon ended the gold standard in the early 70s, supply and demand is the name of the game. The biggest demand, whoever controls the biggest demand controls the world economy, and one of the biggest demands on earth today is oil. Now, the word that's overemphasized in the media is democracy. I know Mr. Hitchens is a philosopher. Does he really think that democracy has ever existed? Isn't it the United States more like a nation of wage slavery? I don't feel free at all. I've lived here my whole life. Isn't it like a system of economic dictatorships?
Let me start with Mr. Warren. We'll come back to you on that. You heard the call. What about democracy in this country, Mr. Warren?
Well, I think it's in rather good shape, unfortunate degree of economic inequality aside. And as far as the claim of something like 29 countries where there's not much religious tolerance, I suspect it's much, much higher. The status quo in most places is lack of democracy, lack of religious tolerance of any sort. Again, I take the president at its word. We went in before this morphed into a humanitarian aid mission. We went in there to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. And though I do think that securing Middle East oil has been a central priority of U.S. foreign policy, on this one I don't think it was the #1 reason we went in.
Well, to say the United States was a democracy in the sense of the people ruling would perhaps be to flatter it somewhat. I mean, in the building that you can see behind us, a fairly small number of special interests can most times outvote millions and millions of voters. But, and that's notorious, but I think you would have to say of the United States that it was a remarkably open and pluralistic society, where the expression of all opinions and the coexistence of very great diversity is very striking, especially to an immigrant like myself, and with a considerable respect for law. So not bad. I think the motive for the liberation of Iraq was much more political than economic. It was, I think, very necessary to do something to alter the balance of power in the region. And there was, in any case, an unpostponable appointment with the keystone state of that region, Iraq, just right between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that we'd had since 1992, when the close of the war to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. We had appeared through President Bush Sr. to promise the Iraqis that if they rose against Saddam Hussein, we would support them. And when they did, we did not. So we'd incurred a debt, and we were also keeping Iraq under international sanctions, which was something of a mutation of its sovereignty. And we had adopted Iraq, in a sense, already as a responsibility. The real, Jim keeps recurring to 1992 and Somalia. Really what one should recur to is 1992 and the failure to remove Saddam Hussein in good and sufficient time. We would now be 15 years into nation building and democracy in Iraq if we had not backed off that crucial responsibility at that time.
Speaking of immigrant,
15 years for the locust.
Speaking of being an immigrant, when will you raise your hand to pledge allegiance to the United States of America?
It'll be in your state, I gather, because my paperwork is in the system. I'm somewhere in the Homeland Security.
In Virginia.
And if you apply in D.C., you're deemed to have applied in Virginia. So I'm hoping to do it in Charlottesville, actually.
And
hey, if I can, can I add something as you know, as a child of Austrian and German immigrants? In the case of my Austrian mom, someone who fled Hitler as he was after he had moved into Czechoslovakia and was about to come in to Austria. And something that bothers me about the last caller. There is a certain growing sort of conventional wisdom in the form of a certain angst when it comes to describing the current state of American media. In the building right there with you guys at 400 North Capitol in Washington, D.C., you have several other news channels, MSNBC, and most particularly the currently ascendant news channel, Fox. And there's all this trepidation about increasing numbers of ideologically driven news outlets. I mean, I tend to find this first rather salutary and ultimately a sort of back to the future example, a throwback to days when there were 50, 60, 70 years ago in cities like Chicago, there were 6, 7, 8, 9 newspapers. I think the homogenization and centralization of media, which we have seen over the last 40, 50 years, has not been particularly wholesome. And I think what is playing out also with the internet is generally, you know, a healthy manifestation in the turn of the media, though I don't buy into a lot of the slobbering over the internet and the cries of joy over the old traditional gatekeepers like the Tribune and New York Times and CBS News now being demolished, because I think there's a lot of unadulterated crap that one tends to find on the internet too. But it's just a way to say to the caller that I think his is a rather caricatured notion of this country, and there's a degree perhaps of increasing pluralism, especially when it comes to, you know, folks like Chris and me and others giving our 2 cents on an array of outlets, and I think that's again really quite salutary.
Sour Lake, Texas, you're on the air.
Hello. Thank you very much for C-SPAN, and thank you, James Warren and Christopher Hitchens. Wanted to particularly compliment Christopher Hitchens and tell him I will certainly go out and buy his book. And I appreciate so much his scholarship and his analogy of events. And my question is, given the majority voter registration in Iraq of the Shias, once the election takes place, would you please comment on how you think the protection of the minorities will go forward?
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, we touched on this earlier, and I hope others who may have noticed that will forgive me if I repeat myself a little bit, but the contacts that I have at any rate with the Iraqi National Congress and the Shia, so-called Shia list, lead me to think that they're very well aware that there's a danger of them winning too big, if you like. They don't want to seem like a triumphalist or a sectarian party. They've made considerable efforts to reach out, as the saying goes, to those Sunni politicians who are willing to have a dialogue, and the relationship with the Kurdish minority in the north is very warm and very good. And remember that the Kurds are largely Sunni. There are 1 million Kurds in Baghdad, as well as many in the north. I mean, the thing I think is worth bearing in mind is this. When the press says to you, as it does every day, Iraq is divided between the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds, that's not really comparing like with like. I mean, the Kurds are not Arabs, but they are Sunni, for example. And it's a bit like in Bosnia, the press used to say it was the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims, once again only giving one people their religion. Beware of this, I would. I've never met an Iraqi who can't boast of, if he's a Sunni himself, of a Shia brother-in-law, say, or cousin, or perhaps a Kurdish uncle. It's very much more common than otherwise, especially in the cities, for that to be the case. This isn't a very hard and fast discrimination, in other words, and there's some reason for optimism that people can get over it and think like Iraqis, and think like Democrats. Anyway, the main point is this, and I don't want to sound starry-eyed about it, they have the chance to do that now. Politics is back in Iraq. Everything can be discussed. And that, I think, is so worthwhile that I'm surprised by how much easy cynicism there is about it.
Christopher Hitchens is at our table in Washington, and James Warren is in Chicago, and this program this morning, we're mixing and matching different issues here, including these transcripts that Mr. Warren published, this one on January the 18th. It's a discussion between Barbara Walters and Henry Kissinger, and I wonder, I'm going to read a little bit of, I just wonder, this was in 1973, and you say that here NBC's Barbara Walters, she's now with ABC, speaks to Kissinger about the parameters of an on-camera interview she desperately wants for competitive reasons. And here's what it reads. It says, Walters, when will I hear from you? Kissinger, are you home tonight? Walters, I'm going out to dinner and I'll be home later this evening. Kissinger, see, consumed by jealousy. Walters, I know. The real reason I want to do this interview is just to have a few moments with you alone, says Barbara Walters. Kissinger.
How revolting.
Oh, I knew that. With a camera, you like warriorism. And he meant, I guess, voyeurism. It's an accent thing. Barbara Walters, should I call you when I come home, or will you be sleeping? Kissinger, later in the conversation, now you know I'm going to be sitting there waiting. Walters, you're so full of baloney. How can you be so marvelous, so fantastic, so interesting, so brilliant, and so full of... That's the first question I'm going to ask you. Kissinger, oh, if you complete the sentence. Walters, laughter, I'm glad you're back. Kissinger, thank you, Barbara. Is this kind of stuff normal between... Is it?
I mean... you can't eat enough to vomit enough, really, can you, with a thing like that? It's the really rebarbative element of writing about Kissinger. Well, one of the very rebarbative was the absolute fawning and grovelling that he got from my so-called profession. I mean, Ted Koppel would have him on Nightline, not as a controversial person to talk with, but as the independent arbiter of everyone else's and consultant of everyone else's conversations. He has a column in the Los Angeles Times that's syndicated in the Washington Post. It isn't worth the paper it's printed on, but he always gets his side of the story printed in the New York Times. Always lionized by people like La Walters. Just really awful, Mr. groveling.
Do you feel that strongly, Mr. Warren? There's nobody here to defend Mr. Kissinger, so...
Well, some of this stuff, particularly with the likes of Walters, verges on soft porn. Simple as that. If you have a chance, Christopher, some of the, fabled Brit journalists of the day of 50s, 60s, and 70s show up in these chats. I think Henry Brandon. There's several. And there's one conversation, Brian, it was on last Monday and Tuesday. I can't remember if it was Brandon, but again, it's a very prominent Brit journalist of the time, and Kissinger calls to see if he can borrow his swimming pool that weekend. As simple as that, and the instant answer is what we would have expected. Of course, come over and bring Nancy, his then-girlfriend, later wife, Nancy McGinnis.
Though poor old Brandon, who was a terrible toady and fawner, I think was very shocked to find that it hadn't stopped kissing or bugging his telephone. So even while his boots were being licked by these people, he was doing them bad turns.
Boston, Mass. Thanks for waiting.
Hello, my name is Joe. I'm calling from Boston. I have a couple of minor comments and then a question for Mr. Warren. First of all, I guess please don't cut me off. I've got so much, and I'll try to be brief. First of all, there isn't a person that I know, including myself, that believed for 1 minute that Iraq was A, possessed weapons of mass destruction, and B, had any links at all with Al-Qaeda. I believe with all my research and information and knowledge of history that that this was a sham from start to finish. And the prospect that was put forth that George Bush will go down in history as anything other than the single president that almost demolished domestic policy as well as international relationships. And at the end of the day, he will be accredited with dividing our friends and uniting our enemies. And the question for Mr. Warren that I'd like to pose, if I could, is what is your reaction to the ongoing onslaught by the right-wing media that somehow the liberal press is in control of the message in this country? If you could address that, please, I would appreciate it.
Mr. Warren.
Well, it's part of a much longer discussion. I think it's a grotesque caricature, though I'll be the first to admit that on a range of issues, affirmative action, death penalty, abortion, that in a lot of our elite newsrooms you will tend to find a distinct degree of consensus. I think on a day-to-day basis that is not reflected in the vast majority of work that we all do. A paper like the Chicago Tribune, you know, where we're out covering fires, county board meetings, just sort of all those run-of-the-mill important things in people's lives. I have a hard time seeing how the likelihood that one of our folks voted for Kerry impacts all of that. Has there been a similar consensus on certain issues among the broadcast networks? Yeah, I think there has been, but what I find a greater reality is what has been generally sort of a lack of diversity of opinion. I mean, if you take a look at what Christopher knows far better than any of us, you know, the definitions of the left in Europe, we're sort of poverty-stricken. One of the things I still laugh at is when one looks at some of the shout-fest shows on television, those folks who are sort of characterized as lefties, certainly by European and many other criteria, they would be at best, you know, sort of centrist to right. So again, I think it's a far more complicated matter. I think the caricature, nevertheless, has sort of taken hold of this elite liberal media, and I think we're all victimized by it.
Anything to add? Let's go to Rogers, Arkansas. You're on the air.
Well, hello.
Hi.
Hi, Brian. You know, it's been a marvelous study to observe Mr. Hitchens' views evolve over the years, and it's been wonderful to watch. I know people that don't get stuck in a philosophical or political rut. It's marvelous, and you know, I must say that I'm in agreement with most of what he says, and until it comes to Mother Teresa and Israel. But that said, you know, I admire his intelligence and erudition, but I just like to put this to you, Chris, as a proposition. And if you just find some historiological fault in what I say, okay. I mean, email me. I'm daddyo45@yahoo.com. If you can't get it, that's
okay, go ahead.
DADDIO at Yahoo.
Okay.
If you can't get it all said now, because I'd love to carry on this conversation with you. Here's the proposition. Britain should return Ulster to the Irish. The United States should return Mexico, Texas to Mexico, and then Israel should return the West Bank to the Palestinians.
Thanks.
First, thank you for all those kind words. Second, I can't object if you say that I'm evolving. I sort of hope we all are. But in fact, I don't think my position on Iraq has changed at all. I've, for many, many years, been a friend of the Iraqis and Kurds who were struggling to remove the regime of Saddam Hussein. Everything that I do comes out of a sense of solidarity with those people, most of whom actually have leftist backgrounds, or did when I knew them. So, just as a point, I think that the partition of Ireland was a very serious mistake, and it's being very slowly put back together again, and very gradually demographically. Actually, the Protestant Unionist population of the 6 counties, of the 9 counties of Ulster that were partitioned, is becoming a minority within even the partition bit. But there's no way in the meanwhile just to give Ulster back, because there is a large population there that simply rejects the idea of quitting the United Kingdom. I think you'd find an even larger number of people in Texas who would not want to come under Mexican rule. That would include also, I think, a very large number of the Hispanic Texans. Your comparison with the state of affairs in Palestine is therefore completely inexact. I mean, the Texans are not recent settlers. There's no original injustice done by way of mass expulsion. And the world has come to recognize that the Palestinians who live both under occupation or in exile or in dispossession do have a claim to a state of their own. And I hope you wouldn't want to argue against that elementary justice.
7 minutes to go. Boston, Massachusetts, you're on the air.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
How are we doing this morning?
Good.
I just would like to ask 2 questions. One, concerning security with the elections, how many...
Caller, we have a bad connection. Can you work on that, or we're going to have to pass this time?
Is this better?
Yes.
Is this better?
Please go ahead.
All right. As far as the elections are concerned, how many actual Iraqi security forces are going to be able to secure polling stations? And 2, I'd like a brief comment or whatever about the genocide in 1988, 87 with the Kurds, Saddam's genocide against the Kurds.
Okay, fine. Do you know anything about the security forces, Mr. Warren? How many there are?
No, I don't. Other than, I think there's even concession on the part of the Bush administration that we have, not been terribly efficient and effective in training those folks. I think no matter how one looks back on the preemptive invasion, I think there are even some diehards in the Bush administration who will concede, or at least conceded to me, that the disbanding of the Iraqi army was a huge tactical mistake.
You've been to Halabja, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Yeah, Halabja is the town in northern Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's quite near the Iranian border, which was destroyed by chemical weapons after the Iran-Iraq war, as were approximately 400 other Kurdish villages destroyed or evacuated, and usually accompanying this with the, excuse me, I shouldn't say evacuated, I mean subject to mass expulsion and deportation. Many tens of thousands of Kurds are still missing from that period, though occasionally they turn up in mass graves. I think it does qualify as a genocide, because we have, from the captured documents of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, a reason to conclude that the campaign that they call the Anfal campaign was a real attempt to erase the Kurdish population of northern Iraq. So it would meet the standard of prosecution under the Genocide Convention.
Last call. Point Reyes, California. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning. I would like both of you to comment a little bit more on the original mistake that I've heard you both actually mention. I did the actual back channel work between Saddam's government and the U.S. State Department, and Saddam was being offered normalization if he would get rid of his weapons of mass destruction. And according to Mr. Blix, he had. Mr. Blix, in fact, called Mr. Bush a bastard for invading when he did. And I would present to you that the original mistake is allowing Israel firsters into our policymaking process and using our American government to create the greater Israel, using our American government and our American men and our money to create this greater Israel. So do you really believe that this Iraqi election will be accepted if it goes forward?
I've just thought of something I meant to say to Daddy-O, 45, which is that if you like or don't like my stuff on Mother Teresa, you still might like the chapter I have in my book about testifying before the Vatican against her sainthood cause. You may think that's not much of an answer to the previous gentleman, but I think unless you give us your name, sir, we've no right to assume that you were involved in any back-channel negotiations between the United States government and Saddam Hussein's.
Let me ask you on that.
It was a rather quick change of subject to the Jewish question, I thought. Something shady.
But let me ask you both about the Israeli Constitution. What you know about it is, we're talking about democracy in Iraq. Is it wide open in Israel that anybody that goes there they have freedom of speech? Can they participate in the system? Can they become citizens? And
well, certainly if they're Jewish and if they qualify under the law of return.
But they have to be Jewish.
Well, you can be a citizen of Israel in two ways. One is, like me, to have a Jewish mother, and you can go and claim all the rights of an Israeli citizen straight away, which, yes, do include most of the constitutional protections that we mean by democracy. There's a great deal of pluralism for Jews in Israel. The other way of doing it is to be one of the Arab citizens who avoided being thrown out in 1947 or 48, who were made into Israeli citizens and who have seats allotted to them in the Knesset.
We're running out of
and the
time.
right to vote. So.
Mr. Warren, I want to give you a chance on that one. Anything you want to comment on the Israeli thing?
No, I concur with Christopher, and this is my final chance to say anything. I just want to tell you and your viewers that I hope you're not too modest in future days about the fact of your increasing cultural iconic status and having made it into the script of the Gilmore Girls the other night, Brian. I hope this results in a precipitous increase in the number of female teenage viewers and listeners to the Washington Journal.
I think the only issue here, Mr. Warren, is appreciate you mentioning the Gilmore Girls, but what were you doing watching the Gilmore Girls?
We have a financial interest. We own the WB along with Time Warner, and given the state of the Tribune stock right now, which has been going south, anything I can do to boost those WB ratings, even watching the Gilmore Girls, I shall do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warren, for joining us in Chicago this morning. And Mr. Hitchens, I asked you earlier, and I think Mr. Warren stepped on your lines, you're going to become a citizen in the year 2005 in Charlottesville?
Well, I don't know how long it'll take for Homeland Security to get round to me. I mean, there's a big backlog now of citizenship applications. But I'm in the system somewhere. And yes, I'm deemed to have applied in Virginia, and my book on Thomas Jefferson will come out this year, in May, I think. And my dream has always been to take the oath at Charlottesville.
We've got to go live, and I thank you. We've got to go live to the Senate Democratic only Policy Committee